for some folks who are not going to TPAC, this might be your last chance to grab a handful of these stickers. So hit me up or Vince up. Also, it was pointed out by the ever observant Hong Chan that the folks working on web codecs happen to be sitting right next door. And so they may stop in and visit us at some point. So we'll may pause if we see them all pile into the room and welcome nobody here. Okay, nope, haven't done that yet. That's it for my list. Before we dive in, any other comments from the crowd? Yes, so, okay, I will get in, yeah, so let me describe the structure. Okay, so least proposed structure with feedback from Vince and others. We are going to, sorry for the frantic scrolling. Okay. Unless somebody else volunteers, I'll coordinate this first one. Hopefully we can get volunteers for the next ones. What I want to do is just start with a provocative statement, permissions, and get shout outs from the crowd on topics that you'd like to discuss or learn more about around permissions, concerns, places where we've got new APIs related to permissions you'd like to see, how permissions should apply in different contexts. There are some provocative statements up here. And what I would love from the crowd is ideas shouted out or typed in, and then we can start discussing those. I'll attempt to coordinate. We can hand around mics. As we talk, it would be great if we could crowdsource scribing notes in here. Speaking of, okay, live captions were working. Never mind. And it'd be good to hear people's thoughts as we go through on things. And then towards the end of the session, wrap things up, identifying takeaways, attempting to summarize what we learned from this, and so forth. So what are folks, when we say permissions, what does that bring to mind as concerns, challenges, open questions?
So I kind of would wonder who is the authority to sign off on this being a good permission model, and if that should be like sort of spread out, especially when we have multiple companies kind of working on the same sorts of things, and how that could play out if we should have some sort of formal like everybody votes or something like that.
Other thoughts around permissions. I'll throw out one, which is right now we've got very limited API surface for actually web browser or web apps to introspect permissions. There's been talk for quite some time about extending that API surface to allow requesting or allow web apps to revoke their own permissions that way. Curious if anyone knows if there's any traction on standardization or implementation there.
What about like one-shot permissions, especially for geolocation, or like at least like time permissions? Like, okay, it's fine for the next 10 minutes, but then please don't.
Yeah. Yeah. I know, I guess. Okay.
I'm curious about enterprise policy interactions with with permissions.
Okay, this all seem good. Any last, Chase?
I'm interested in understanding how we can best harmonize between like local permission models in a native environment and the permission models we want to implement around our APIs. Like how would we rationalize a single permission model that works across many different platforms?
Did I summarize that correctly? or approximately. Okay.
I'm going to tack onto the non-permanent permissions, just expiring permissions. Should we clear out things that are a year old, haven't been revisited?
I'm interested in how we present permission to the user, where they would find the permission settings for PWAs. How does that differ from how does it differ for installed and non-installed websites, and how does it differ from native apps?
Is that, just to clarify, is that within the scope of how we present permissions to users, or was that a sequence of?
All of that's within the scope of how we present permissions.
Okay, and then I missed the last one. So how we present permissions to users in PWAs, in non-installed and non-installed contexts, and
Installed and non-installed, just the drive web origins for the drive-by web and native apps.
Okay.
It kind of goes somewhere along the same lines of how we present permissions to users, but some sort of thought process in how much interaction we should have from the user, so that we don't just kind of, one click is for dangerous things is kind of bad because they might just click on it. I like the choose. You have to think about it and choose an option. Is as much as we could do that, probably better.
Whether we should take installation as kind of a sign to auto grant some permissions.
which I think is related to, but not identical to the first one.
We could also provide more information about what permissions really are to for users. I know for some confusing things, there are Google support pages, for example, some sort of page with a little more information, although that does mean it'd be more information to keep updated.
One of the things that I found interesting with at least working on storage was sort of the struggle for attribution. Same with RAM, where it's all right, is Chrome using lots of storage, Chrome using lots of RAM? Oh no, it's this one site. So I'm kind of thinking about that permissions in the same light of, I really don't have a ton of visibility as to what can use what permission and what site is using what permission at what time. Android's doing a better job of this now, where it'll tell you, oh, this app's using your location now in the background. How are you cool with that? I'm wondering if having more of a continuous exposure of permissions that are being used, especially really scary ones, might bolster the or help things that do need scary permissions actually be released, because there's more protections there around telling the user when things are being used. Yeah, that vein of summarizing or exposing more than just the first time.
So I would like to extend the first bullet point with what I call the anatomy of granting permissions to apps installed from stores. Essentially, I would like us to look at this process, which starts with the user somehow ending up in an app store, then installing an app, and then subsequently granting a permission to this app. And just looking at this process and trying to identify what exactly is the magical ingredient that makes users comfortable with these apps actually getting access to sensitive, powerful capabilities and granting sensitive permissions. I just want to make sure that while our mental model is that if it's installed, then the user is comfortable with more powerful capabilities, and maybe we should gate the ability to ask for certain kinds of permission to install state. Is that really something that matches users' mental model? In users' mind, is really the installation something that expresses this higher level of comfort? Or maybe it's that they acquired this app from an app store where there's a review process, there are other user reviews, and there are other user ratings, for instance, or maybe other step in that process. I just want to make sure and hear what everybody else thinks around this.
Cool, so we should probably cap compiling this list. But with that very provocative question, what do people think here? And I would love it if folks could jump in and help crowdsource this, or the notes here.
I think anywhere we can get data is interesting. Reviews are very gameable. And I know that, Android originally started with this very, you've granted the location permission. I keep using location, but you grant permissions on install, and those aren't revocable. Like the app, there's not an easy way to. There wasn't an easy way to revoke those, and the way they were designed, and they've been walking this back for years, so that now it's much easier to just have that not work anymore. So I feel like any data that you can get is valuable, but I also would be worried that we wouldn't want to be too permissive with what we would grant when someone's explicitly installing something.
Yeah, I guess to kind of add to that, I think it depends on the permission, right? Like I think when you install something, things that have to do with interaction with local stuff, like if you installed an app and then it asked you every time you wanted to save a file, whether you have write permission to that directory or whether it's okay to write to that directory, that would be weird because it feels like once you've installed something, you're expecting that it's interacting with your operating system. But on the flip side, something like camera or microphone, it would be very weird if installing an app automatically gave you access to camera or microphone or things like that. So I guess maybe the way I would think about it is like things that are local to your operating system, like storage or file system or things like that. When you install an app, they feel like things that the app can interact with, but things that are outside still don't.
Yes, Alex and Thomas.
Back in 2014, I think, 2013, 2014, one of the reasons that we were able to get PWAs launched in the first place was that Adrian Porterfeld and company did a very small set of user studies to try to understand what users believed about what an app is. And we tried to work with Helen Harris and her team to try to validate some of those assumptions. I don't know to what extent we've externalized any of that understanding. And I don't understand to what extent that data has decayed, right? Have user expectations changed? Any of that? One of the important takeaways that allowed us to move forward was that users didn't have a model of what an application was, other than that it was something that they launched and then it was standalone. And so that was sort of the distinguishing characteristic of an app versus, yeah.
I just wanted to mention that I think there is a difference in users' minds between when you install and download and like double click an installer versus when you see a prompt in Chrome that says install and you then hit install. I think there could be some user differences though. I don't think we actually have done sufficient research to necessarily know. Also wanted to just bring up somebody else's work. Dominic Eng out of the Sydney office compiled a really good paper on this topic. And the conclusion of his exploration was at a high level that we shouldn't be restricting capabilities exclusively to PWAs, unless it's things like icon badging, which make no sense outside of a PWA. But rather that we should look at installability as a signal that users want to have an ongoing relationship with this site. And so, for example, for file system, we applied this principle and said that if you are in a tab mode, then each time you kind of leave the origin and close all the tabs for it and come back to it later, you'll have to re-get that permission to that file. But if you're an installed PWA, we expect the user to be coming back to this experience, and therefore we'll let you persist the handles across sessions.
Okay, let the scribe flush the buffer. Classification of permissions. Like I would like to build understanding, like try to put these permissions in a couple of buckets, like very scary, sharp edges, less concerning. And this would be maybe from the user's perspective, so that we could design maybe different type of UX flows or UIs for super scary versus less harmful. Let's say things that you can revoke without any further consequences. I mean, in the scary bucket, it's like, hey, some site gets to read all my contacts and send them to their server. I can't revert that. But versus, my device can read my sensor accelerometer data for a period of 1 minute after I revoke it, after it's gone. So I don't know. That's a tool for reason about this problem space. Put these things in the buckets.
Yeah, I wanted to like express concern. I don't think that installing should give more permissions, especially because we are trying to eliminate friction and make it easy to install. I think along with what Thomas was saying, like if you download something and double click and install it, that could be a little different than you just click the plus and you just install it in one click. Someone could almost even be tricked into doing that, and if it's giving permissions, that I think that's worrisome. Some sort of a balance between giving friction and no friction. But I also want to say I really like the idea that if it's downloaded and installed, there's almost definitely they're going to be coming back to it. So more persistent permissions make sense, but not more permissions, just keeping them for longer.
So this might make the install flow a little bit more complicated, but what if you can decide what permissions you want to allow before installing? I know native applications have like a setup, like you can select options, maybe something like that.
Yeah, I was going to say basically the same thing, except for not from the manifest, because the dev can't control this. It has to be the end user. That we can't. I would be very hesitant to grant any permissions without explicit user permission to do so, which means I think during installation you either prompt like a wizard, like you would do with a .msi or whatever when you're installing a regular app that you download, or at first launch, either way, but never before a user actually has the explicit intent of accepting the permissions. And then I think that they can be long-lived because of the installation. I think the installation does indicate a relationship that's more involved than a tab. So I think that as long as we prompt the user, we can have long-lived, but we can't have any permissions without prompting the user.
So, sorry to take another crack at this. We have gamed out various positions on the spectrum here, and I do think of it as a spectrum where you could imagine fully emulating the native application install flow that you might have on Windows, right? Where you force people to like we package you an MSI, the user has to double click it and then it installs. Maybe that's quick, but that would be the flow, and then therefore the user would understand everything that's happening there, right? For instance, bouncing users through an app store would get you a similar level of understanding potentially from the user perspective. I like to frame these as a question, right? What do we believe, what users believe is kind of what we're trying to game in many of these cases, sort of apart and aside from the question of the raw capability. And so we can set this location at any different point along the spectrum for any particular capability. When we've talked about manifest-driven permissions in the past, they've been exactly in that style, where we would potentially present the user with a list of things. Maybe they're all unchecked by default, and they can check them or check them and uncheck them independently. But that's part of the reason that we've driven so hard on the permissions API. And one of the reasons that we're anxious to get to a place where the permissions API supports a request method that lets you request multiple permissions at the same time, because then you can model it very naturally in a desugared way. So there's a lot of places here, lots of moving parts, but if you think of it as a spectrum from super lightweight, we can grant it in a tab everywhere all the time, and maybe we don't have to ask, or maybe we can only ask for forgiveness rather than permission, to you have to ask up front, you have to ask in context, you can only ask after you've been installed, and only when you've been launched from the home screen or from the user's dock. That's maybe another location in the spectrum. What we believe about each permission, we should try to chart along that location.
Oh, I got a mic. You can get back to me. Hey, okay, so I had two little thoughts. One, I think the climate has been changing for what people expect from permissions as well. So I think even over the last year or two, I think there's been a sizable change in at least the tech press, and even the outside of the tech press, but still the press, about what we want out of iOS, out of Android, out of Facebook and other social media sites. So we have to engineer and design towards where things are predicted to go. not just where things have been recently. Another point, I have a hard time visualizing where we even are today with permissions. I would find it really interesting to lay out a big spreadsheet or some other visualization of what are all the things we ask for permission for, what are the defaults, when do the prompts happen, what type of prompts are they? Do we already have this visualization?
No, I was just going to go to permission.site and just click all the buttons.
Yeah, so okay, I can go, so it would be interesting. It varies on desktop and mobile, perhaps not. Are these things the way we want them to be, or do we want to unify? So there's actually an enormous project in even tallying up where we are today with permissions, and if we agree with where we are today, even much less the new introduced permissions.
Yeah, I think John, did you?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, I thought you.
Oh no, I was just going to say, could you paste that link in that whatever thing you were just showing?
Oh yeah, sorry.
I thought you were going to ask me a question.
Yeah.
I guess I just had a response to what John said a few bullet points ago, and I think that I would generally agree with the sentiment. I think it's important that we don't grant permissions until we've explicitly asked the user. I also think we want to be careful around if we have install time permissions or that we make sure that we don't create a flow where it just becomes a lot easier to grant the permission to install the we don't want to have a flow where it's a lot easier to grant the permission than to not grant the permission. And I think that's just something that we want to keep in mind.
To add to that, I think I mentioned earlier also about my reservations with like install time permissions, because it's just harder to reason as to why the app is asking for the permissions that it's asking for. It feels like it makes more sense when it's in context. But apart from that, I think the other concerns I have when talking about permissions is realizing that permissions technically is decision making for the user. So each time there's a prompt, they're actually deciding. And if you multiply by the number of applications that will be actually seeing this permission, it's going to be a lot of decisions that the user has to take. So I am wondering if there are cases in which we can smartly choose or suppress some size from asking permissions. Like, I think if you're concerned about bad actors, there is something that browsers can do proactively to suppress bad actors, versus right now I think the approach is mostly like we rely a lot on the user to make the right decisions.
I just want to jump in. I think somebody alluded earlier today to common sets of permissions that are asked, for example, in the VR, XR space, where you want accelerometer, magnetometer, camera. There's probably a cluster there. You can almost imagine that if you used a new permission API, you could ask for that cluster, and we could say, this is would like to do XR, because we know that's how it's going to be used. So that's there. Probably have like one or two more questions or comments, and then jump to one of the other topics, such as around time box permission. So,
yeah, I guess like a permission could probably have something like a report site icon. Especially like I get all these sites now, and after Chrome decided to block permissions, they will create this interstitial that will ask me, do you want to approve push notifications? And you say no, and they'll prompt you next time again, because they're so afraid that people press block.
So create sites incentives to behave, create great or good permission flows. Because now they go through the path of least resistance. So how can we avoid asking the user, or how can we get through, just click through those yes. Yeah.
That's a very interesting observation. Never occurred to me to have this kind of feedback loop where users can report, kind of like how Gmail defeated spam by having few users mark things as spam, and then the whole ecosystem benefits from it, the whole benefit of the users. The reason it disconnects a little bit to what Narata was saying, that we protect ourselves so much because there are some bad actors, and they do exist, but the price that we're paying, we're imposing that cost to every single user. And so things along those lines, I think, should be interesting. I mean, the thought exercise that I think I go through, that I don't know what the right answer is, but I don't know what the right sentiment in the room is or what users think. But how many of you feel uncomfortable with the apps that you have installed on your phones right now? Like, all of you have Android phones or iOS phones, and like, to me at least, or like we're all using Mac devices or Windows devices, right? I don't know how much I care about the bad actors. Like, I know that some apps will misbehave, but like the Flash app that I have, the Flashlight app that I have installed on my phone, probably has access to network sockets, but I probably don't think that it accesses my router or my printer, and I don't know why. But yeah, it seems to me maybe reviews or app stores or things along those lines would play a role.
Cool. And I think one last
I just want
thing
to
on this
say that I
topic.
think we are losing that trust with cases like Facebook and abusing permissions. So I am personally starting to wonder about like what my apps are doing. And now I got like Android 10, it starts showing me, oh, so even I haven't used like Lyft since it was in the US, it says me, Lyft is accessing your location. Do you want to allow it to continue doing that in the background? It's like, hell no. Like, why is it doing that? So I think like that is even like making it aware that apps are doing more than they're supposed to do, and it's changing the whole perception.
Okay. Daniel, keep it short though.
I had a very small note about the notification permission. I think we tell people to do that, unfortunately. I think we say you should have a pop-up that asks people if you can show notifications before you request it. And I think that's something that could be improved, but I think that's actually something that we tell websites to do, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. Okay. I think one of the other meta topics in here that it got a lot of attention was around non-permanent permissions. So I wanted to shift to that. So thoughts, should we do that? Are we already doing that?
Just a quick time check. So we've got about 10 more minutes agenda-wise for this, and we should save some time for wrap up. So
What did you just ask?
all right.
What did you just ask?
Oh, I just asked, what are folks' thoughts around non-permanent permissions?
Yeah.
Yay. Okay.
So this actually can help. This can kind of tie into the choosers are better. We were actually just talking about this in a break. You can choose how long to give the permission, and that gives a little more interaction. You've thought about it a little bit. You decide how long you want to give it. And then when that time period is done, you'll get prompted again, and you can decide then what to do again.
Isn't that one more decision we're forcing on the user then? Not just use it or not, but how long?
Yeah, and I could see how that's a bad thing, but also how that's a good thing, because then they're thinking more about the permission instead of just like click, 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 just get me through here. You know what I mean?
It can have a default scene like forever, and you click on it and choose 10 minutes.
Dissenting opinion. So everyone's excited about this, but keep in mind that this isn't free. When a developer is building the app, they won't notice that permissions are expiring. So they'll have to make extra effort to code an app that will still behave properly when these permissions expire. So we're adding brittleness.
Should sites or the browser mediate basically, once in a while notify the user, hey, you're using this site and these are the permissions that you have granted a year ago. Are you still fine with this? Should we ask that as a reminder?
About what you said, Victor, I think if we just only expire or revoke permissions while you're not on the site, nothing should break, because sites must expect that when you visit them, you might not have given the permission yet.
So sites should totally expect that. That's very different from someone building up some code. just wanted to point out there's a cost.
I think there's an interesting brainstorming happening here, kind of on the subject of more ways the browser can ensure that permissions are like more robust. We talked about the Android location. Do you want the background thing again? Maybe you granted this permission a year ago. You sure that's okay? So there might be an interesting small brainstorm here around what are other ways that we can expose more visibility or controls on permissions.
Just one thing on that. I think that if it's a site I haven't been visiting for a long time and I go back, maybe that's the time to say, hey, you have permissions, you want to review them, or just like accept. Like even Google does that for like other details. So I think that that's kind of okay, especially if I granted like dangerous or powerful permissions. I think it would be okay to review them at that point.
I think this is particularly important when we talk about granting additional permissions to something that's been installed as opposed to a PWA that's in a tab, in that you probably don't, we assume that because you installed it, you want additional interaction or additional relationship with that site, but that might not be true. You might not even come back for a week or for a month or for a year. The installation may not actually be the correct indicator.
I think going to Kenneth's point, maybe the settings UI can list also the last time you visited the site or the last time the permission was used or something like that to increase the visibility of the permission. Yeah.
Scribe is ready, I guess. So when some powerful capabilities are combined, they are more, 1 plus 1 equals 3 in kind of powerfulness. So should we somehow, should we do something about it? So should the prompt kind of highlight that you have already granted 5 powerful capabilities and now the site is asking 1 more?
So to maybe help move into takeaways and action items, sounds like a lot of this is speculation in what the user would want or what they expect. Can we like hire a sociologist or something to get some data on this? Is that possible? I think we need more updated studies. When we mention studies, it's always almost with like a caveat.
I mean, we can't hire a sociologist, but we do have a research team, the Chrome UX research team. Permissions seems like a very big area, so I'm sure the research team would be willing to invest more in us understanding the space. I think today's brainstorm is a good way for us to like tease out the biggest questions we have that we want answered. Some of the discussion was in the solution space, but a lot of it is also about the fact that are these problems real problems and how we reason about them. And I think these are good questions to bring to research and be like, hey, can we investigate this? Yeah.
And I think that Microsoft and Google and other characters may have differing opinions about how the permissions UI should be presented and how important permissions are for different levels of permissions. Like Microsoft might feel that file access is way more important than socket access or something. I don't know. But I think it'd be really interesting if we approach this from 2 different perspectives, because it'd be really bad if a user came to outweb.io and installed it as an app from Google and was prompted for the location, or installed it from Edge and were not prompted to give the location, and so then they would just install it from Edge because they're not going to get prompted. So I think regardless of what actions we take out of this or what experiments or what customer feedback we get, we have to land in a way that we are in agreement so that we don't have a different user experience for the customers, because they'll just use the one that's the path of least resistance. But we also have to consider devs and the funnel. And every time that you put a prompt in front of somebody installing your app, they're more likely to drop off. And so devs are going to hate anything that affects the funnel. So we have to consider that too. I don't know if that's a takeaway, but it's
that prompts another question in my mind, and and this maybe is a rabbit hole we don't want to go down right now. So I'm happy to let it go onto a list for later prioritization. But when you start getting into interface differences, I wonder generally how we even address that from a spec perspective, because I could swear I remember somebody saying, I think it was you, Alex, and I must be because he's getting up, that specs, the deal with specs is that we all agree on the spec and we compete on interface.
Yeah, that's the essence of the line that we try to draw, or at least that Chrome engineers have attempted to draw inside of web standards, which is to say we have actively worked to remove any language that would constrain the UI that can be put around, specifically around permissions, in order to preserve user agent flexibility. We're not ignorant of the fact that everyone's going to do a simulated annealing towards the quote unquote right answer over time, but we do want to admit diversity of views while we all iterate towards what the right thing is going to be, and to admit that we are likely to be wrong ourselves, and so anything that is normative in a spec around UI is likely to be insufficient over time, and we don't want to have to rev the spec to do it. So we try to put a hard line in there. We try to make sure that we don't put required UI places in, but we do also try to ensure that there is adequate time. So we make these APIs and these requests for permission asynchronous, so that we have the ability to either silently deny them, silently allow them, consult the service, ask the user, re-ask the user, ask the user 5 times, do whatever dance is necessary to get to the quote-unquote right answer for the user in the situation that we're in, and then reflect all that state back to the permissions API so that we can come to some sort of a way for the programmer to understand the current state of the system. So it's a complex dance, but there is this clear line that we cleave where we require async APIs for requesting prompts or permissions, and then push back hard against normative requirements on UI and specs.
As a follow-on to that, one of my takeaways from this entire week was, I think, Kenneth's comment that despite the fact that we were not going to spec UI, having plausible UI sketches appear in the explainers is incredibly valuable. And I think that's something we haven't consistently done and we should start doing. So more requests for mocks from Namrata are going to be coming. And then Chase queued up, and then we're going to cut it off for time.
Yeah, I just had a quick kind of reply on the topic that John brought up of different user agents, different browsers caring more about certain permissions. And just wanted to call out that there's actually at least 1 or 2 API proposals that are in the pipeline for us around font access, where in the explainers, we are explicitly saying that some browsers or user agents that take some perspective on font access, and they say that you shouldn't have the ability to look at local fonts, will just silently reject. And we're expecting that, and we're accepting that as a part of implementing the spec. And then almost to kind of what Alex was saying too, that we have to allow for the ability to have that rejection occur in an async way and possibly silently. And kind of tying into the sociologist issue, I feel like there are some user agents, like users are self-selecting in, and they're using, say, Chrome, and then there's other user agents like Brave that somebody might choose because they are concerned about some aspect to web browsing. And that's almost like building a permissions model around that particular kind of user, and they might care about things that other user agent users might not care about.
Thank you. So we'll let my replacement scribe finish up. While he's typing, does anyone remember what we had as the next breakout topic?
Is it?
Hybrid apps. Yeah. Okay. I'll. It's okay. Yep. It's okay. Wow, that was a lot of notes. Okay.
Thank you for assisting note takers. Darwin, you win.
Okay. Vince and I would like to request somebody else come up and do the wrangling for the next session. Can we get a volunteer? Both of you talked a lot.
That's true. I apologize for that. Hybrid apps.
I'm going to say Tom now. Thank you. Round of applause.
So I do think let's get a solid note taker though for Tom. Let's have Tom facilitate the conversation and have someone take on scribing. Darwin, thank you for your support, but let's find another person.
Oh, if you just go to...
There's no coffee or
just go
drinks.
to
It's
dash
here to
Fugu.
yeah,
So it's the short
that's
form.
right.
present
So okay,
dash
yeah, I
Fugu.
mean that's like yeah, maybe go grab stuff quick. People who want to grab stuff, do it.
Yeah. Just
Keep
the long.
Yeah,
You're welcome.
if you're grabbing coffee, get it done.
You've got your set. Okay. That's, I'm flip this closed. And I'll sit down. Flip to notes or go/fugu dash tok dash 2019.
Meanwhile, everyone who stayed here, let's all stretch to your
Scroll down to the bottom.
stretch.
Don't put your font size. Oh, you have to be chromium.org account, so switch your account. It is, okay.
Ask one small question while people are taking break, because we are talking about permissions. Is Chrome and Edge team doing anything to influence other people who are not implementing navigator.permissions, permission API?
Just uncheck that. Oh, you did. And hit that so that the title bar goes away.
Because that means that for every API we have to do our own foobar.request permission, and you get the point.
The state of the permission requesting APIs is a bit of a tough one. Mozilla has pointedly and repeatedly pushed back on a permission request method, which deprives us, on the one hand, of an ability to retrofit existing permission requesting APIs in a more useful way. It deprives us of the ability to reflect more intermediate states. I think we've got one right now, which is the permission to request is itself a permission, and that problem sort of occurs across a bunch of different surfaces. And they've also pushed back on a drop permission method. So if you wanted, for instance, in your application to provide a toggle or a slider that says, no, I really don't want to let this thing track my my location, for instance, if you asked for it before, we don't have that ability. It's sort of basic computer science that you should operate with least privilege, and we don't allow that on the web platform today. So those are places where I've struggled personally, and we've written position papers for the permissions workshop last fall to this effect to try to understand and then address those concerns. But they don't. I can't. I've worked hard at this, and I can't get my head around what Mozilla actually wants. So WebKit, so almost everyone implements the permission reflection API. We have let folks know that we're going to have to go it alone on the request side of it. And so we're going to go out and lead, probably. That's probably our next step. Apologies in advance.
Okay. Hello again. My name is Tom. I'm from Chrome DevRel / Web DevRel. And Pete and I, we just came from Shanghai, where we had the Google Developer Days. And in preparation of this trip, being aware that China is what we call mini app land, with WeChat and like a couple of super apps as hosting apps for a number of like a big number of mini apps. So I thought, yeah, we're going there, pitching the web, knowing that it actually already has sort of lost. The talks kind of reflected that, or talk attendance rather. We had the most unattractive stage, like the one where you had to go like 2 escalators up something. And yeah, the rooms were smaller than like the Android or the machine learning rooms. They were not super full. Nevertheless, it was good. The people who were there were engaged and stuff, but you know, we felt, or at least I felt, I don't want to talk for Pete here, we felt like, yeah, it's hard to be there. So in preparation of this trip, as I said, I went and tried to understand with my zero knowledge of Mandarin, why is that? And I read a couple of articles, and I was surprised to learn what's going on. So WeChat is one of the super apps there, or actually the biggest super app, and they have, since launching their mini app store, which was, I think, 2 years ago. If anybody is more familiar with anything what I'm saying, please just jump in, correct me. They have now reached more than 1 million apps. The Apple Store took more than 10 years to reach that number. So they must be doing something right. And yeah, I was wondering, what do they write? So I just tried to go to the website and follow the steps to get started. And I was surprised. It's sort of English, so it's not perfect English. I'm not a perfect English speaker at all, by no means. But sometimes the English to me even sounded funny, but they made an effort. And you could actually work down the different steps. So the first is what they tell you, apply for an account. I do have a WeChat account. It's one of the foreign accounts that essentially can't do anything. So I can chat, but you know, all the banking, all the whatever, it's blocked. So you can't do the first step here, which is like open this and apply for what they call something like a tourist mode, where you can just, as a guest, create, it might be just a funny translation, but it's called tourist mode, where you can create apps and stuff and play with it. But I tried to like circumvent that, and somehow you can still build apps. So I downloaded the thing which is called the WeChat Dev Tools. And to most of you, this looks pretty familiar, I guess. Let me quickly walk you through. On the left-hand side, you have the simulated device here. You can switch iPhone X, Nexus 5, whatnot. That's pretty cool. And then up here we have Zoom, no big surprises. And then we got, and everyone who works with networks will love this, simulated network speeds. So you can't really zoom in here, but it has 2G, 3G, 4G, and offline. So that's great, because it gives you the ability to check different network speeds from the start. They don't assume everyone has 4G or LTE, whatever you call it in your local markets. They make it adaptive. Then you have like reset buttons and stuff. You can mute, la la la. And then you have something that looks essentially like the VS Code left-hand bar with the Project Explorer. You have here the editor. And down here, you have the console, sources, network, security, app data, audits, and so on. So all this sounds pretty familiar. It's a mix of VS Code. It's a mix of Chrome DevTools. It's a mix of, yeah, obviously just the device emulator. And yeah, you can then actually get going. So the cool thing is, if you go back to the documentation, they have a component library. So if you click that, and for example, you open the map component, this is a component that allows you to put a map in your app. And this is actually just a web component. So some of you may be familiar with the Google Maps web component. I think back then it was written in Polymer. That's essentially that. So you have attributes where you can set certain things like where should it start, should it have controls, and blah, blah, blah. So all the things you need on a map. And you can then just put this on your application and work with it. And it turns out they have a ton of these components. So every single thing that you might want to do with a 2019 UX paradigm, like carousels, like sliders, like form widgets, la la la, everything, camera access, and so on. They have a nice component that you can just pull in and then run it. So what is also nice, let me try to find it on here. I had it open in my history somewhere. Might be this one. Yeah, navigation is sometimes a little funny on these. Might be in the API section. Sorry. See, file device. Yeah, here, for example. So they have a ton of what we would call Fugu capabilities. So if you go to the API section, they have iBeacon, so that's the Apple NFC thingy. They have Wi-Fi, and let me zoom in. From an application, you can control the network. So you can turn off or on the Wi-Fi chip. You can get connection to battery. You can add new phone contacts. They have raw clipboard access. They have NFC, network, screen, phone calls, accelerometer, compass, device motion, gyroscope. So there's a lot of things. This is barcode detection. And everything lives under this WX namespace. The easiest way, sorry? Oh, okay. Yeah, this, I had no idea what this meant. I just, yeah, took it as given. Anyway, so everything lives in this WX namespace, Beijing. So the nice thing now is if you go there in the console, you can actually just play with this. So the easiest is wx.user, and you can see this is Chrome Dev Tools. So there's a function. I'm not sure if I can increase the font size. Let me try. Oh, yeah. Quickly clear the console. So you have this WX get user info, and yeah, then you can program. Wait, let me just use the other mic. Turn this one off. So you can program a little thingy here. So you need a success function, takes a result, and then we can just console.log the result. Oh, what went wrong? Oh, yeah. Oops. Yeah, thank you. Actually, let's console table it. Console table, here we go. So you can see WX get user profile has my user info here, Thomas Steiner, my avatar URL, gender is 1. I'm pretty sure they don't have 2 or 3. They just have 0 and 1. I would assume. My province is Hamburg, which is true. I haven't probably set a city, but this is default. There was no login step needed. Why? Because WeChat as the hosting application obviously is connected to my user profile. So that's one thing. And I think I had a different window open here. So this is kind of weird because you don't have the Windows menu here. They must be doing something weird. Let me try to find the other WeChat windows. There's no permission prompt for get user info? No, because you are logged in on, who asked the question somewhere here? Oh, here. Yeah, you're logged in on WeChat. So for the simulator, for this entire thing to work, you need to scan a barcode that the app generates, and then you're logged in with your contacts. And from there on, you can work as you logged in.
Is it obvious to the end user that they are logged into WeChat when they're interacting with these apps?
Oh, here. It's surprisingly hard to figure out.
Yeah, sorry, the sound's coming at you from all directions. I was asking, is it obvious to the end user that they are logged into WeChat when they're interacting with these apps that are? Okay.
Yeah. So you're logged in. It's just like, I don't know, when you have WhatsApp or something, you know that you are logged in. You know that you are you. What you might not know is, how easy it is for an app to then get your social network, for example. So this is what they made really, really easy. So I went and just had a look at what is in WX. So let me get, again, a little bigger here. So WX. So if you scroll down, you can see there's a lot of APIs. So just don't spend time reading it. It's a very long list of APIs that you have access to. So essentially what they did is and Electron has a pretty similar model. They just made all these lower level device capabilities available as higher level JavaScript functions that they put on this WX namespace, so you can pretty easily use them. But what is different from Electron is that here you have the logged in context, which makes things like payments, things like get user information and so on, super easy. The way from 0 to hero is also pretty great, because in the documentation, and I'm not sure if I'm finding one now, in the documentation you have these links. Let me try to find one. As I said, I'm not entirely familiar yet with how the thing is structured. Might just be here. Media. Voice. Sorry, I don't find one now. Anyway, so in the documentation, they have links where they say just see this API in WeChat Dev Tools. You click the link, there's a local server running, you're brought right into a new project. So if you go back, project, open recent project, yeah, that's the one I wanted to show. They bring you right into a from 0 to hero project where you can just easily get started. So let's zoom in here a little bit if this is possible. I can't apparently zoom in here. Okay, so I can zoom in the console, but I can't zoom here. Anyway, the overall structure of this is you have an app.js, which just launches the thing. You have app.json, which describes like the views and the baseline styling of this. You have WXSS files, which are WeChat CSS essentially. And with all the VS Code things that you would expect, so you can see color previews, color pickers, and yeah, IntelliSense code completion and stuff. So you can see all the things that a proper IDE gives you, project configuration. And this is something that is pretty interesting here because they have this ES6 post CSS. So essentially what they have here is they made the build process just super easy to configure. All you have is this compile button here, you press it, and then your application is being compiled, and you have something that you can then submit to WeChat. And this essentially just bundles everything, makes everything super easy to use. And yeah, from there on, you can start. So there's no setting up build steps. There's no figuring out what is the right, roll-up configuration. They just made that for you. So from 0 to hero, again, super easy. And you can then take that, download it, and yeah, submit it to the store. And then the actual program is here. So this app has just one page, so you can see it is just me. This is simple photo booth thing, so you can click the link and then you can take photos, and there you go. So on load, it creates a camera context, take photo, start recording, stop recording. And this is all the code it needs to get a photo. So you can see there's a nice level of abstraction. Some baseline styling here. So in XML or WXML, you describe how your interface should look like. So you have a view, and then in the view you have the camera. You have 3 buttons, and then the thing where they print either or the paint either the image or the video that you take. You can see here there's this WX if. So if you've been around for things like XSLT or Vue or something, this is all pretty familiar for you, I guess. And yeah, so the question is, if we take all this, and the last thing I wanted to show is just CSS for this view. So you can see here, just random standard CSS. With something interesting, they have the RPX, so the responsive pixels, which is pixels that are aware of the device pixel ratio, so you don't have to translate that. It just works automatically. So with all that, I was wondering, they did a lot of things right. So what can we learn from them? Is this much of a threat for us? Is this an opportunity for us to learn? And sorry for talking so long, but I thought it was interesting to give people the background on that. And I don't claim to have full insights into how this app model works, but it's a pretty nice separation of interface and then the JavaScript code and then the declarative web components and stuff. So I was wondering, what can we learn from them? Is there anything that we can learn? And something that I proposed was to have something like, this logged in context where you would have something like navigator.profile, and this would then take profile information, for example, from your logged in profile. And you could, like that, ask the user very easily, hey, do you want to, I don't know, get access to who you are? Do you want to grant access to your social network, your Google contacts? And when I say Google, in this case, it's just Google in Chrome, but it could be a Microsoft account in Microsoft Edge. So navigator.profile is like something that you could ideally maybe even dynamically switch. So you could say, for this app, I want to use Microsoft account as a backend, or maybe even something local or Mozilla profile or whatnot. Because I think this is what makes, what is pretty unique to this kind of app model, that you're logged in by default. And you have a lot of bootstrapping that is just easy for you to get started with. We have the web SDK that is pretty easy to use. So the question to the room then would probably be, what do you think we can learn from that? Is there something that could be useful for us? And I'll shut up now and let the room lead the discussion, I guess. Oh yeah, sure.
So what is the permission model they use for all these powerful APIs that they expose under VX.?
Permission model is essentially, if you are a tourist app, you can't access certain low-level device APIs. So in guest mode, you can't use certain things. And then for other more powerful APIs, you have to grant permission, just like a regular permission prompt. That is a modal dialog, regular as with us. And then there's levels of trust, and this is where it gets pretty vague. So if anyone knows more than I do, they have just like with KaiOS, where you have the hosted apps and then you have the packaged apps and so on. They seem to have something similar that has different levels of trust. And of course, once you get into their mini app store, you have been reviewed. So they are pretty sure that you are not a bad actor, or if you are a bad actor, turn out to be a bad actor, they can kill you. So say again? So the remark was they also host this. Yes, they host the applications. You can't just have applications on your own. There's something interesting that I'm not really fully sure yet what it is, but if you go to project and say new project, there's something where you can have a WeChat web project that essentially just loads nothing. So bootstrapping the thing takes a little while. A WeChat web project essentially just launches a browser with pretty regular Chrome Dev Tools. So let me check in the audit yet. So they even have just Lighthouse here. So I think because Chrome is not that big of a thing here, they just took Chrome and built it into WeChat Dev Tools like that. If you go back to a regular, different project, they have their own, how do I do this now? I think this different window. If you go back to a regular project, they have their own auditing tool. Why do I not get back now? New window?
I guess this is a full view web view.
Oh, so this is the thing that they present for logging you in. So you scan this with your phone where you're connected to WeChat. I think I need to exit now and start fresh, because it seems to completely switch the mode that you are in the application. So they have their own profiling tool. I don't have my phone with me now. So you can see it's it forgets that I was logged in. And by the way, they killed the local server. So you don't have, like with Zoom, the local server running all the time. So I guess that's a good thing. So yeah, I think this this is a pretty powerful model. And if you do something like navigator.profile, combine it with, I don't dare to say AMP components, but something like AMP components that have, performance and so on baked in, and that are fast by default. We automate the build step away by having some sort of SDK like that, not SDK, IDE like they have. We might actually be able to provide a similar experience than they do, but obviously on the open web, because in the end, and I dug into this a little bit, like what you create is essentially a web application that runs in an iframe. All they do is they have this power top level object, WX, with all the device APIs and so on. But in the end, there's nothing that prevents us to do the same on web. And I think, as I said, the way from 0 to hero is pretty straightforward. So the onboarding, like if you don't have to write a rollup configuration and so on, is just great, I think. You wanted to say something, John, I think. No? Just making gestures? Okay. Yeah, so I don't know, maybe we can talk about Electron, because I don't want to take the entire session just talking about WeChat mini apps. Something interesting next week at TPAC, they want to standardize mini apps. Interestingly enough, WeChat is missing from the proposal. Everyone else is on, like Tencent and I'm not even sure how to pronounce the names. Alibaba. Yeah, so they're all on. WeChat notably missing. So my interpretation, with my super limited knowledge of the Chinese app or mini app market, is they unite against WeChat. Say again?
Tencent's on board.
Tencent is on board. Let me.
Tencent owns WeChat.
Oh.
So WeChat will be on board.
Oh, okay. So you see how limited my knowledge is. Interesting. Okay. So in that case, this is pretty interesting thing. So this seems like they're all united.
No, actually, there's, as far as I know, there are two camps. This kind of technology in China is known as mini apps. One of the implementations is known as mini apps, and the other implementation is known as quick apps, which is, for instance, what Xiaomi is pushing. And I am trying to understand, like, what is the actual difference, and why can't they just use web? It seems to be a collection of web views. They believe that some of it is implemented native and therefore is faster, and they can't get the right performance on the web, neither capabilities. And I want to understand, like, why that is. Whether it is because they have great components, as you said, which is something we're trying to bring to the web with import maps and like SGL toasts and the likes.
So I think having everything in one namespace like they do makes a lot of sense, or they don't have a namespace essentially because their web components don't have dashes in them. But like what Ion, for example, is doing, what's it called? Ionic, who have the Ion namespace, it makes it easier for people, or AMP, who just have everything in AMP, because mixing namespaces always seems to be confusing for developers. Something interesting here in this white paper, at the very end, they have this gap analysis annex, and if you open it, it's actually, I haven't gone through it in its entirety, but they have looked at what can PWA do, what can Quick App do, what can Mini Program do, what can Mini Program from Baidu do, and I'm like that. I think there's also a little bit of like app or program. Do they really mean different things in the Chinese original terms, or is it translation problems, or is Quick App and Mini App maybe just sometimes translated as the same thing? So it gets hard to understand relatively quickly, but this is a massive, or has been a massive work to just compile this list. So you can see here, for example, they look at custom elements, the W3C rec status, supported on all platforms. So this is a very long list of all the capabilities. So if you, I don't know, barcode might be on there. Yeah, so barcode, you can see in editor's draft. Yes, I think this is web system.barcode. It's a private implementation. So for a lot of Fugu APIs, they have, as I said, in WX namespace, in WeChat's case, they have this listed. So
This one. I guess the question is why they're interested in standardizing this, and the question is, do they have the patience to wait? Because this is China, they move really fast and they make partnerships instead of waiting for standardizations.
I have no answer to that. So I just remember my very first TPAC, which was it 3 years ago, I think, where the very first time I heard about this pretty similar consortium of different companies for the first time announced something like that. I know that Alex was in the room back then. He's not now. Oh, here we are. Do you recall what, like, the very first time they tried to bring that forward?
Yeah, so there's a series of, kind of to address your point more directly, I view this as an evolution of the approach. So yes, there have been a series of attempts. One of the things that has justified divergent systems has, in addition to the desire for lock-in, right? So this is an obvious and transparent play to convince developers to build an integration for their services in your super app and not another. But if you are not the winner, that's a bad place to be. And how do you compete? Well, you band together with your fellow non-winners. So this may seem familiar from the web experience, and so I've seen a bit of an evolution in the few presentations I've seen. The first one at in Lyon. No, Lyon was last year. The first one a couple of years ago was very focused on how the web could never do it. The second one was a little bit more, especially from the perspective of binary size. That is to say that these are new implementations. They're not reusing web. Many of them are not reusing a web view specifically. To Thomas's point about native widgets being easily interleaved. But they are custom rendering engines in some cases. And then more recently, there has been some, I would say, some conversation around the costs involved with a go-it-alone strategy when you've got, 5 or 10 different players who are all asking developers to make an app for their one and only platform. So that divergence and lack of portability eventually bites, and maybe China's moving fast enough that we are seeing a consolidation much more quickly than we would in another market. I don't know, but I'm eager to talk with them next week.
So I started this document, potential inspiration from WeChat Dev Tools, and I made a couple of bullet points down there, and a couple of folks have commented. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Justin. So I guess, yeah, we can take some things from what they do. And yeah, in the original announcement, I used this Philip Schindler term, steal with pride. I changed that to inspiration, take inspiration from. So Philip Schindler used to be in the Hamburg office, and he said that all the freaking time, but I recognize it's not the most inclusive term, I guess, to use. So yeah, I think we can get inspiration from a couple of things here. Like the IDE, I think it's really good. It's fun to work with that. You have Chrome Dev Tools, you have Edge, you have Chrome Dev Tools, you have code, VS Code of sorts integrated. I know that Edge are doing work in that field, which is great, and like the Elements thing and the VS Code integration in general. So there's definitely some things happening. Navigator.profile is just my random musing of how this could be named. So the WX logged in user profile thingy. Something I didn't mention at all was Open Social, which was a thing like 10 years ago, maybe. When I first started at Google, we did a round of developer events across the globe, and we tried to get people to implement Open Social. And Open Social essentially is a way for social networks to make their connectors accessible in a general standardized way, so that you can say, give me my contacts, give me my username, give me my avatar, and then it would just translate differently to the native API calls of LinkedIn, of whatever social network you might be using. And I think this is something pretty similar, but on a browser scale, where we would say, give me my avatar, and then Microsoft would pull in the Microsoft avatar, and we would say, we pull in the Google avatar, and so on. I think the overall concept back then was small widgets that you would have on desktop applications. Nowadays, I think we can at least maybe get inspiration from how this worked in the past to see how we can bootstrap application development right from the navigator object. Something they also do is the guardrails. So because of the components that they ship and that they actually require you to use because they want to get a sort of consistent way to experience applications, it's sort of a way to make sure you don't shoot yourself in the foot. And STD Toast is one example where, we try to do something pretty similar. The build process, I talked about that. No Webpack, no rollup configuration, just pressing off a button and you're done. The hosting is web packaging of sorts with the optimizations that something like the AMP cache does. And this is just a list of things that I came up with. I guess if a lot more people brainstorm on that and we throw away a couple things and focus on the really worthwhile efforts, it might be, a good thing to start and work on that together. Sam.
So also,
In one of the...
Hey, Sam, real quick note. So we're scheduled to wrap up in about 7 minutes. So just time check.
In one of the presentations from Microsoft, from you, I think, if I recall correctly, you had one of the things you were exposing to Windows apps or PWAs was something on the lines of the user's identity. Did I get that right? And if so, does that sound more or less what Thomas was talking about, navigator.profile? And if so, can you share with us a little bit more some of the user journeys, the products that are looking into getting that information, and what kind of information or profile information Windows would have from a user? Like, are we talking about like, first name, last name, email addresses, profile pictures? Can you share a little bit more about how much Windows knows about the user that is logged in?
You good? Or you want me to? Okay. Yeah, so the case that we're talking about is you can log into Windows devices with like an @Microsoft.com account. So it's similar to like if you're logging into your Chromebook with a Gmail account, and then once you're logged in, any Google app you launch knows that you're that person. So it's not necessarily being able to access all of your data. It's being able to not prompt you to keep logging into different Microsoft services once you've logged in. I don't know that we've figured that out yet. Oh.
Sorry, I thought it was different thing. So I was talking about like Microsoft's account authentication just. So it is nothing but like Gmail and Google account login, and web applications just leverage that login information to just go ahead with automatic authentication for application itself. So it's just based upon the user identity of certain OS or services.
Importantly, I think that doesn't grant permissions to location and to these other API that we were talking about before. Because you grant one app and your Windows account permission to use your location, it doesn't mean that you grant all the other apps permission, which is what this looks like it does, which is really interesting to me. Yeah.
This is more about
interesting is in quotes.
Yeah, that is more about like Gmail and Google Docs both under make someone re-enter the password each time they launch.
FYI for people who will be at DPAC next week, on Wednesday, there apparently is a mini app breakout session there as well with a summary, meet the major mini app players, etc. So, if you're interested in talking to those guys, directly. That's a good idea.
So I guess we have to see this also with where the proposal is coming from. And I don't want to step on anyone's toes, but definitely the approach to privacy is different in China than in other places of the world. So we don't have to, like, one-on-one, obviously, take inspiration from everything they do. There's ways where we can fix it, of course, and make it better. But as I said, the main motivation of me digging into this was understanding what do they so right that apparently people have just dropped it in favor of have dropped web in favor of this new thing. So I think I found some of the answers, but this is very limited, of course. Like, if anyone has done more research, or if some of my conclusions are wrong, or I'm saying stupid things like WeChat and Tencent, like, please jump in and correct. And I'm very much looking forward to talking to them at TPAC as well.
Yeah, so as part of this topic, two of the other things that I don't think we're going to have time to get to is kind of the spectrum of hybrid apps and how we want to think about, like, Electron and things like that. We talked about it briefly day one about whether we think of them as like competitors to PWA or sort of a point along the spectrum to people eventually becoming PWA, and also distribution, like getting people to package their apps and get them into stores, and like PWA Builder is something that obviously on Microsoft we've invested in. I think you guys on Google have too. So if there are people who want to talk about those things, I'd certainly be interested, like, after the breakout sessions are done. So just wanted to pitch that.
I'm going to chime in briefly on this topic. I think much of what I see in the mini app space from what you described, thank you, because I didn't look directly, is very similar to what we had with Chrome apps. And I think the profile and identity access is again similar. And I don't think it is implied that it bundles all the permissions, right? I think the permissions are actually separate, which is how the Chrome extensions infrastructure works. And I would highly suspect they're actually using the same infrastructure. I could be wrong, but I wouldn't be surprised if they just, grabbed that. I think part of the reason for success is the network effect of the app. So they're meeting the users where the users are. The developers have to go there. The users aren't on the web. The users are in the mega apps. And so the developers are going to create content for the mega app. And there's substantial benefits to having something that's not a web browser, right? It's more than a web browser in that it has a social network opinion, right? There is the social network for that browser. And once that's there, it comes to great utility. In Chrome apps, Chrome.identity was very popular. It was used a lot because it meant you could get access to any API that Google offered as a REST service without causing users to go through an OAuth flow. And it was very beneficial because the user's already logged into their Chromebook. So it just plumbs right through. So I think in terms of understanding why developers are flocking to this, that's the model that comes to my mind.
Yeah, definitely true. So in the white paper, they pitch this actually, and this could be a PWA pitch essentially. It's free of installation, multiple web views to improve performance, which I think they mean workers. OS capabilities, more trustworthy. Like you click link and it's not scary. Distribution and so on. So QR codes play a super important role. One of their examples down here is this bike. So you just scan a code, and then the thing through a protocol handler knows which bike app to install, which is essentially just opening the PWA inside of WeChat, and then you can just get going with your ride. So as I said, most of this is just PWA, but presented in a mini app context.
So I just want to put my perspective in there. I've actually built a WeChat app, and I worked for a Chinese company, and there was like a contractor that wanted us to build an app, and I actually didn't use any of those tools. I built it in Chrome, and it just ran there, but all of their users, they just used WeChat. So they wanted it to be there because that's where their users were, and that was like the sole reason. 3 years ago, almost 4. So yeah, that was their main reason. Everyone that they want to use it is on WeChat. That's where they look for their apps. So that's where they wanted it.
Like Facebook. Europe. Facebook 2 years ago. Yes, 2 years ago.
So in part, I think it is not only like technical. There are not only technical reasons, but how they actually successfully built the ecosystem and application like ecosystems. Yeah, probably.
So we should probably cap this. Thank you so much, Tom, for leading that.
Thank you.
The amazing demos. That's an excellent question. Not crazy. Let's definitely take a 5-minute break now.
5 minutes.
And then we'll see what the agenda looks like when we're all back.